Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to share that window again just to sort of go over what we're going to talk about this week. Um, for the second class, I want to focus on a couple of years, which are just 1959 and 1960. This is when the bulk of the original Corona project development took place. You can see in this timeline that the project was approved in early 1958, and there was basically a crash effort of all the companies involved to bring it to fruition. It really took an enormous effort. Just to review some of what I talked about last time, Lockheed was the primary contractor, and iTech was a optical camera company, advanced optics, up located in Massachusetts outside of Route 128 Beltway. I think they were in Waltham, but they designed the camera. Fairchild ended up building the camera, or maybe building the later cameras. Kodak was brought on board to work on the film because none of the existing photographic film was suitable, mostly because it was too brittle when it was as cold as it gets in space, and it didn't handle well in outside the atmosphere. So they had to actually invent a whole new film for this, which is basically the backing material that had to be redone. The emulsifying layer was fine and so forth. Um, let's see, who else? Those are the major players. Oh, GE was got the contract for doing the reentry, and that's because GE had a fairly significant amount of experience doing. Oh, Marty's coming back. Um, GE had fairly extensive experience doing reentry vehicles for the earliest ICBMs, and they had basically solved the problem of how to stabilize a satellite in orbit. And that's, of course, essential for controlling the trajectory and the reentry, but it's even more important for putting a camera on board and having it be able to take pictures. If the satellite is rotating or tumbling or anything like that, of course, that makes it impossible to take pictures. So Hilly Page, who was like the divisional vice president at GE above this project, he joined um, the Philadelphia contingent in '58. Ingard Clausen was the first program manager for the project at GE. So he was not the overall project manager, but just the reentry systems project manager, and he was the one who hired my father as the first person to join the project, under him to join the project. And that was kind of an interesting sequence of events because they had both been working in this division at General Electric for a while, and they knew of each other. But Ingard called my father one day and said, "Listen, we have this new project, and I need you to go out to the West Coast for a week or so right away." So Bob packed up his stuff, went on this business trip, left all of us young kids and wife behind, went out to Sunnyvale, California, where Lockheed was working on this project. Everything was just getting started. And they put the two of them in a couple of rooms that had no furniture in them except a few desks that were completely disassembled. They hadn't been built yet, and a couple of drafting tables which hadn't been built yet. And they said, "This is your office. Get to it." So Bob started assembling the drafting tables, and Ingard hauled the desks into the next room and started putting them together. And that's how they got started on this. They ended up staying for 2 weeks, and they ended up drafting the preliminary original designs for the reentry vehicle and presented them to the Lockheed people before they left. And they said, "This is what's going to look like. So plan for that." And then they came back to continue working on it in Philadelphia. Um, Later that year, Ingard Clausen was replaced by Ed Miller as the program manager. I'm not sure why Ed Miller took over. I imagine that it was because of corporate politics and so forth. I know I've met Ingard, and he's very definitely, an engineering nerdy type guy. So I'm sure he didn't play the internal corporate politics as well as Ed Miller did, because Ed Miller was known as a people person and, you know, the kind, an excellent manager, and everyone respected him and were glad to work for him. So that's probably what happened. But Ingard was really important for this project because he assembled the initial team. He picked the best people he knew and got the whole thing going. And real kudos to him because he kept the project in his mind through the entire length of the project and afterwards. Because in the 90s, when the project was declassified, he always had in his head that he wanted to document all the experiences of the people that were involved, and he wanted them to write up their memories and so forth. And he had the idea of publishing a book when the time came. And in fact, that's the book that I sent the link to out in my original email for the course. Um, and I might as well, we'll talk about that next week some more. But kudos to Ingard for really sticking to the whole thing and making the book happen and so forth. Um,
Yeah, Doug,
yeah.
Keith had a question. Looks like Marty answered it. Wondering when your father, how old he was when your father began the project.
He was in his early 30s. He was, or mid 30s, I guess. He was, let's see, he was 33 or 34 when they started.
He was
Yeah,
born in 25.
right. Um, so yeah, it was a relatively young group of people, really at their peak professionally.
He's
Um,
33.
and yeah, I think they all were fairly young, other than the management team. So they started in early 58 and they worked all the way through 1959. That's when they had their first launch attempt in January and February. About every 4 to 6 weeks, they'd try a launch, which meant they had to assemble all the component pieces and put them all together and try launching them. And that was a really frustrating period. That whole year was really, really stressful and really hard because they just had one failure after another. The most spectacular ones were, of course, when the rocket blew up on the launch pad. And we have some film I'm going to show you shortly of that. But the failures came in all the different parts of the systems. The reentry sometimes was triggered at the wrong time. Sometimes the Agena vehicle, which is the second stage of the two-stage rocket, failed for whatever reason. Wasn't stable. It ended up pointing in the wrong direction. All sorts of things. But one by one, they figured out from what limited telemetry they got back from the test instruments what was going wrong, and they tried different things, and eventually they had a successful launch and a retrieval on August 11th of 1960. Now the aircraft were not in a position to retrieve that recovery vehicle by parachute on that first retrieval. So it had ended up in the water, but the Navy had a ship relatively close by, and they dispatched it over to pick up the capsule with a helicopter and bring it aboard. And they took it to Hawaii, where they put it on an airplane and sent it back to the West Coast so that the engineers could look at the instruments that were inside and the telemetry that it showed. It wasn't, it was just about a week later that they had a second launch, and that one was completely successful. It was the first time that anyone had retrieved film from orbit, and they got photographs on that first attempt, or that the second complete flight. And in that case, the capsule was snagged out of the air when it was floating down in its parachute, and they brought it aboard the plane and also took it to Hawaii and had it immediately flown back to the West Coast, and then it flew to Rochester, New York, where Kodak processed the film. Then it flew down to Washington, D.C. to the National Reconnaissance Office, where the analysts looked at the film. What was one of the things that you'll read about in any description of this whole project is that one flight brought back about 3,000 feet of film, thousands and thousands of pictures, way more than all of the YouTube or the U-2 spy plane photography in all of the flights up to that point. So the CIA was just jumping up and down. They were so happy. They got this great intelligence, and the analysts were happy because they were tired of sitting around waiting for something to look at. And they got to work trying to identify Soviet missile bases and all sorts of stuff that was on the film.
And what you got in the newspapers was all about Discoverer. It wasn't about the film or anything. It was just about
No,
these things that were recovered.
right. The news reports will report these two flights as Discoverer 13 and 14. Those were the flight numbers that were given to the Discovery series, and which were kind of interesting because that tells you that there were 12 attempts before that, all of which that failed. But the cover story was Discoverer, and so some of the news was tracking the progress of Discoverer. Keith, do you have a question still? You've got your
Yeah.
Zoom hand up there.
Were they able to control from the ground what, what, where and when it took the pictures?
Well, the polar orbit, where the satellite's going around north to south, and while the Earth is turning under it, eventually the satellite will go over every part of the Earth. So they just waited until it was going over the areas that they wanted to take pictures of. And they also coordinated with the weather forecast to make sure that there wasn't an overcast at that time. So they had to time that really well. They could send up very limited commands to the satellite, but they could tell it when to start and stop taking pictures. So they did that when it was over the areas that they wanted, um, to photograph. And they had to estimate how much film was left and so forth and so on, to be judicious about when they took those pictures. Gary.
I can add some context about the launch vehicle. It's every time I think about this, I'm kind of a little bit in awe at the state of the art of the electronics, the state of the art of everything at that point. Relative to modern times, it was the Stone Age. The launch vehicle, the Thor, the booster, had been designed in 55 and put into service in 57. It ended up being an extremely reliable vehicle, but that's along the way. It had a few issues to resolve. It was a liquid oxygen and kerosene, or refined kerosene as propellants, about 158,000 pounds of thrust. And the control electronics assembly, I was a launch controller on one of those, on that booster. The control electronics assembly was vacuum tubes.
Mm.
And it had enough poop to get to the outer limits of the atmosphere. If you wanted to put something into polar orbit, you needed a second stage. In my case, that was the project I was on. That was something called a Burner 2 that had a good sized solid rocket motor on it. In your case, it was the Thor Agena, and that had a hypergolic propellants on it for a very good reason. It could be shut down and then restarted. And the fuel was UDMH, and the oxidizer was IRFNA. And those two things, IRFNA stands for inhibited red fuming nitric acid. It's really nasty stuff. The UDMH is unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine, which is poisonous. So to be around that vehicle, the Agena vehicle, and was fully fueled, you're putting yourself, not only was it was toxic, let's put it that way. But present day, I'm an electronic engineer, and I graduated just a few years before I started into, actually graduated, went right into the Air Force, and transistors were new. There was no such thing that I was aware of integrated circuits at that point. That was still a few years down the road. So we're talking terrific things that were done with pretty minimal technology.
Yeah, they didn't even have electronic circuit boards in these early satellites. Everything was done with hydraulics and electric actuated, electric motors and so forth, and explosive bolts that would separate the parts of the spacecraft when it was needed, things like that. And I have no idea how they got the signals up there to tell the sequence. They had what they called a programmer, which was basically an electric circuit that would time things. And so once you started it, it would time certain things. And they would just get triggered at different points. And how they kind of cobbled that stuff together to make a functioning reconnaissance satellite is just beyond me.
Well, one of the contexts in the Thor booster had a flight timer that had programmed actions in it. In other words, and it was literally a little box with a motor-driven spool of 35 millimeter film that had holes punched in it,
Hmm.
and they would actuate as little switches as the film passed over the switch array, and a combination of switches would program when the thing tipped, when it was sort of go straight up, and then it command the gyros to the control assembly to pitch downrange, meaning, and the whole thing.
Yeah, it was sort of like a player piano
Yeah, it
following,
was exactly. And the,
following little holes and so forth. I mean, it's just incredible.
the whole thing was started. There was a little pin that was wired into the launch assembly, launch base that stuck up into the back end of the Thor booster. And when the Thor started lifting off, the pin stayed in the launch, and that turned the flight timer on.
Pulled it out.
Yeah,
and
which I mean, we're
turned it on.
talking relatively crude, which led to an interesting failure mechanism. You had to remember to wire the pin into the launch mount so it didn't go up with the rocket, in which case it wouldn't pitch down.
Yeah, there were a couple of interesting details about some of these failures that
Oh, yeah.
it's like this guy forgot to do this, and when he assembled everything. And one of the things I remember was in the really early days, they were trial assembling the reentry vehicle in Philadelphia, and one of the guys put in a part backwards.
Yep.
Because the bracket that it was mounted on allowed you to do that. You could put it in either way. And one of the other engineers said, "Oh, that's not good. We have to redesign that bracket so that you can only put it in the right way, because somebody's going to put it in backwards at some point, and that would make the whole mission fail." So things like that were, what they were thinking about.
Yep. And if we have time at the end, I can to that exact point, I can tell you even the best attempts to make things foolproof ended up being open to fools.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talked about how toxic the environment was when the whole thing was assembled, and there is a story in the book about how some of the Lockheed engineers, when they put the pieces together in the Agena, they miswired some of the wires, and they realized it. I don't remember all the details, but they realized it right at the last minute. In fact, the rocket was on the launch pad and it was hot. It was ready to go. And they picked two guys from GE to go in and fix the wiring problem. Well, actually, no, now I'm remembering. There was a known problem that the GE guys realized within the reentry vehicle. So they went in to fix that. But after they had fixed it, while they were there, and they were up on the gantry crane, they were looking in the access hatch into the second stage of the rocket. And while they were in there and they fixed that, they noticed that some other wiring that the Lockheed guys had completed when they assembled the whole thing together, that wiring was wrong. And so they proceeded to fix it. And that meant cutting wires and soldering wires together. Now, these were live circuits that were in this thing. And as Jerry said, this is a toxic environment. The second stage rocket could have fired at any moment while they were there, and they would have been fried. Yeah. So crazy stuff, heroic stuff to fix the problem, make that launch happen. Just crazy stories.
Yeah.
That I think is a really interesting one.
I know the names of the two engineers. The first one was Sacrificial, and the next one was Goat.
Yeah. It's in the book.
We got to get the book.
Yeah, let's see. It's on page, let's see, 154 and 156 and 158. So go look for a little more on that description of that. That was Discoverer 12. That was the launch just before the first successful launch. So yeah, they got that one.
Patsy, I'm
They
sorry.
got,
I just wanted to give you a heads up. I think Patsy has another
yes, I
question.
see Patsy's questions.
Got it.
That was the launch just before the first successful retrieval. So, they wouldn't have made the progress they made unless those guys had taken those steps to get that launch working. So it ultimately it failed. I can't remember why. It was well after it got into orbit. But yeah, so that was 12. Um, let's see some other interesting things. I on page 87 in the book, it mentions the Soviet parades. I mean, these were, the big military parades they had in Red Square, where they'd have all the soldiers march by and the tanks would go by, and then the Soviets would bring out their missiles, their big giant ICBM missiles, and they'd have them on trucks and they'd go by, and it looked like they had quite a few of them. But it turns out what they were doing was they'd take the trucks loaded with the missiles, and they'd just drive them around the block and they'd rejoin the parade so that it looked like they had a lot more than they really did. And that's um, that's one of the things that I find really funny about all of this. But that fueled the idea that there was a missile gap, that the Russians had way more missiles than we did, and therefore we had to get in the game, and that this reconnaissance was so important because we were trying to find out exactly how many they actually had.
Doug,
Yes.
I have
Oh.
I have a funny story about Hawaii. I don't know when you want me to tell it.
About the what? Oh, Hawaii? Soon.
Okay.
So Patsy's asking in the chat, what was the public explanation of what Discoverer was doing? The public cover story was that we were sending up mice and monkeys to test what it was like to have actual biological specimens in space, and that there were some experiments that were being done with them. And they had a lab with mice and monkeys, and they raised them, and there was a whole staff of veterinarians and doctors who were working with them, and they developed all of the harnesses and the everything they needed to have those animals in space. How are you going to feed them? How are you going to make sure they have water? All of that stuff was being developed, and there were subcontracts to companies to do all that stuff because they had to make it look real. They had to make it look like they were really doing that stuff. They weren't doing that stuff. They weren't doing that research. But some of the work that was done in that regard ended up really informing a lot when it came a lot of the early manned missions, and there was actual research happening on the ground towards putting living beings in space. And Patsy also wanted to know, couldn't other countries see where the satellites were orbiting? Yes, they could. And that's one of the interesting flaws in the cover story, because if you were really just doing research on launching animals into space, you wouldn't put them in a polar orbit. There's no reason for that. So any country, anybody who was serious looking at what was going on would scratch their heads and say, there's something else going on here, because you don't do that unless you have other goals in mind. But the press and the coverage of the Discoverer mission never picked up on that and never reported that kind of anomaly. Um, you know. So let's see, what else can we talk about? Oh, I'm going to go back to my timeline here, see if there's anything left to do. Share. So let's see. First Corona test flight was in February of 59. In April, second flight was the first to stabilize the capsule, but it was lost. Oh, and then in December, there was a flight that failed because the reentry sequence was triggered prematurely. Now, what's interesting about that was that it brought the capsule down in on Spitsbergen Island in Norway. This is an island that's way up above the continental Europe, I guess you'd say. And it belongs to Norway, but there's agreements that Russians can occupy it as well as Norwegians. So there were a bunch of Russian fishing ports and so forth there. And when the capsule came down, it was the Russians, it turns out, that got to it first. We sent a contingent of military folks over there to search for it. But when they got there, they could see in the snow that there were tracks coming from and back to the Russian little colony that was there. So we lost that recovery vehicles to the Russians. Now, they happened to put in there some instrumentation. They put in there what they called a mechanical mouse. I've never seen a picture of it, so I don't know what it looked like, but they said they put that in there. And the funny thing was that some of the engineers thought it was a great joke to scatter some mouse droppings in with the mechanical mouse as a joke. So that is the recovery capsule that the Soviets got their hands on. And Bob reported that there was a lot of joking and laughter back in Philadelphia because the crew was just beside themselves wondering what the scene was like when the Russians opened up this capsule and saw the mouse droppings but didn't find any mice. And were they running around their facility looking for the mice that had escaped? And so they were treating themselves to a bit of a laugh, hoping that that's exactly what happened. That was a very disappointing mission in December of 59 because, of course, we didn't want the Soviets to get their hands on any of this stuff or to know what was going on. But clearly they have an actual capsule in their possession, which I don't think ever came out in the news because I think, but it was, everyone was very nervous about that because it was, hard evidence that we were spying on them. So anyway, that's the Spitsbergen Island story. Let's see. So February, the National Intelligence Committee concluded there were 140 to 200 Soviet ICBMs that would exist by mid 1961. And there were a couple of other competing systems. There was one called GRAB, which was an electronic intelligence satellite And it was launched and attempted to send back, transmit back pictures. But that was not very successful because the transmission technology at the time was much slower than it needed to be. So you just couldn't transmit back any intelligible photographs. I mean, it was even less resolution than standard TV transmissions, which were pretty low resolution at the time. Um, so let's see. August was the first retrieval and first retrieval of film. And then JFK was elected in the following November. Okay, so we're done with that. And let's see, I think I'm going to show you some video. These are short videos clips that I pulled out of off of a DVD that Marty sent to me,
Hey,
which,
Doug.
yeah,
So when the Russians found that recovery vehicle, there was no film in it.
no,
So they didn't.
no,
So
they were still testing the overall system and they had not put the cameras in there yet. They were still, testing the first stage, second stage, and the reentry sequence.
okay, so they didn't really know what the deal was. They found some interesting technology maybe, but they didn't know what the purpose of the thing was for.
No, not really. I mean, they knew there was a satellite and they knew it was going over.
Yeah.
But yes, they didn't see any film or anything like that, so they didn't know, um, to that extent what we were doing.
Hey, Doug, I had a question.
Yeah.
So, what's the difference between a test launch and a test flight, if there's a difference? And how many of these things did they do, all told?
Well, it took them 14 tries to actually send a complete system up and get the film back. But starting then, and all the way up until when the project was canceled in 1972, there were, I think, 145
Oh,
total launches and total missions, almost all of which succeeded. They had a very high success rate. I mean, I've
I
got a,
guess so, because we would have heard more about it or these failures, right?
yeah, once they figured out, once they had a success, they really, really understood what was needed. And sometimes they would miss the recovery. Sometimes, some part would fail, but it was really, kind of a failure of a part, not of the design of the whole system. So, yeah. So they had a very, very successful sequence of missions right through the 60s. And they evolved the system over time. I'll show you in a few minutes some of the diagrams of the second generation satellite, which had two take-up spools and two reentry vehicles in it, so that they could send up one satellite and have it take pictures immediately, and then have those come back and then leave it up there so that they could follow up with additional pictures at a later date. And I don't know offhand how long the satellite would stay in orbit and how much control they had over nudging it so it would stay in orbit longer. But they certainly had it up there long enough to bring back two batches of pictures per launch. And those started, I think, in 63 and lasted a few years. Well, more than a few. In the end, the last photographic satellites in this series had 4 recovery vehicles in them. And those were monster satellites. I've got pictures of them, but I'm saving the later years to talk about next week. But that, you know, they grew this program into a pretty substantial, refined system. And, you know, they replaced the camera a couple of times to get better and better resolution and so forth, you know, as they went along. Let's see. I am sharing the wrong thing. What am I sharing?
I see the photos in thumbnail
Uh,
format.
are you seeing the senior college logo?
The big green one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I need to restart. Oh, I guess I don't have. Okay.
I can comment about the secrecy that surrounded these launches. It turns out everything that was launched at Vandenberg was classified, period.
Yep.
Inevitably, when when a launch was going off, and that would include the launches off of Slick One, you know, for your program that you're talking about, and the stuff I was doing, inevitably, there was a Russian trawler that would be out offshore, humming along at the edge of the fog bank that was perpetual in the Pacific at that point, bristling with antennas. So as much as everything was secret, they knew to show up at the right time. Yeah. So we used to joke that the only reason for the secrecy was to keep the civilians from understanding how much of their money was being spent.
Yeah. Okay, this is part of I'm just going to play this. I hope it works.
How do you make it small?
We were, of course, absolutely elated with the recovery of Discover 13 capsule. We had been trying for months. We'd had 11 attempts prior to that, and this was the first successful recovery of a man-made object from space. It put the Air Force in a position to proceed with programs that it had been planning and thinking about for a good many years.
I just lost audio.
Oh, yeah, I've lost audio too. Let's just give it a second.
No audio.
Can you hear me talking?
Yes.
Okay, I'm working on that.
Develop an ICBM having a range of 5,500 miles and 1,500-pound warhead with a yield of 1 megaton should make this an extremely effective strategic weapon in the sense of having great deterrent capability. It became obvious, however, that the Russians were working very hard on a long-range ballistic missile, an ICBM. Through GE as a contractor, radar was installed in Turkey. It was within the few months that we had hard evidence that indeed the Soviets were, in fact, carrying on a major effort to develop a long-range ballistic missile. An ICBM program had been authorized. I was given top priority in selecting the people that I considered to be most qualified to work in a program of this kind. A considerable number of academic people from universities entered into the program. We received the support from top management in every major company that was involved in the Atlas program. Recall a letter I got from Lapierre of General Electric in March of 1955, in which he indicated the complete support of GE and their desire to be considered as a nose cone contractor. We were not the only ones working around the clock. So were the people in industry working around the clock. And it was just that kind of a program. Everybody had such a dedication and felt that this was so important that time, number of hours meant nothing. The missile and space period of the 1950s and 60s are undoubtedly the most exciting and challenging years of my life. We brought to fruition the work of the pioneers Goddard and others. We developed the ICBM, the communication satellite, weather satellite, and we also put a man on the moon. Our success was made possible because we mobilized the resources available to us in this country. The next 20 years, I'm sure, will be equally as dramatic as the last 20. And who can even guess what the next 50 will bring?
I've got another one of those, which is also a short clip.
The Mark II also carried a recoverable data capsule, which contained data and instruments from the space portion of the mission. But others were hard at work too.
So this, of course, is Sputnik.
As work continued on the Mark II, other test programs were started for new high-performance advanced vehicles, all of which added to America's arsenal of knowledge. The early years had their share of spectacular failures and disappointments, but the lessons learned from these problems and a continuous determined effort led to success. The progress was steady and sure as the business grew. The creation of NASA in July 1958 gave solid evidence of increasing government interest and support. Just 1 month earlier, a data capsule from a Mark II reentry vehicle was recovered, the first payload ever recovered from space. It was one of an impressive list of GE firsts, providing proof of our growing sophistication and capabilities.
The late 50s represented the beginnings of the space age. We ourselves at that time were heavily involved in the reentry systems business to solve the reentry problem coming in from outer space with a vehicle. During that period, we achieved a very impressive list of firsts, and we were involved in a very broad spectrum of technologies. And this put us in a strong position for the more sophisticated work of the 60s as it approached us.
So there they were talking about the Mark II, which was an ICBM designation, where GE was working on the Mark I, and then the Mark II. And you heard references there to the space part of the mission and so forth. That was all part of the Corona stuff. But of course, they couldn't put that information into a marketing video. Those videos were from 1978. Let's see. I'm gonna do a slideshow like I did last time. Okay, so everybody see the big green screen? So I'm going to go through some of these. I've got a bunch of details of the satellites themselves. This is a picture of some of the film from the from testing, simulated launches where they'd put the film in a similar environment. They had a really nice, a huge building on top of a hill overlooking the King of Prussia Mall in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. And that housed a very large vacuum chamber that was the size of the Agena satellite itself. So they could put one of them in there and fill it with all the, the camera and the film and the recovery vehicle, everything if they wanted to. But they'd put different pieces in and they'd test them in vacuum, they test them in intense light, they test them irradiated, they test them. These tests were from vibration. So they'd simulate a launch and vibrate the hell out of the stuff. And you can see here that the film in the spool was, really kind of falling apart, the early film. And there was a ripple that was created. I can't really see what they're pointing to as far as a ripple, but just picture of some of the testing of the film. Here's a picture of some of the pieces for the recovery vehicle, and with signs that talked about the degrees of freedom, pitch, yaw, and roll, which describes the various behavior of the satellite that it could have. Here's a picture of one of the missiles actually being positioned on the launch pad with the big cranes and accompanying machinery. Here's a picture of a launch. This is a picture of the control room. I don't know if this is similar to the one that Jerry used, but this is the actual control room that they used. And here's a map that shows the trajectory of the launches. They were all done on this cape, which was just north of Santa Barbara, and the launches were all to the south. So they were always directly over the water. They never went over the land because they didn't want anything falling on anybody. So that's the direction. So this is a diagram of the launch sequence and the trajectory, and it would come up flying to the south. It would come up, it would separate from the first booster. The Agena second stage, number 4 there, would fire, and eventually it would burn out and inject itself into orbit. And at some point, it would flip itself around horizontally. It had attitude rockets that were gas-fired rockets. They were called cold gas because they weren't burning fuel, but they were just spewing gas out in order to rotate the satellite around. I'm not sure if they rotated it and then took pictures, or if they took the pictures first and then rotated it just before reentry. That wasn't clear in anything that I was reading, but the thing rotated around so that the nose was pointing backwards. And when they initiated the reentry sequence, the explosive bolts would, and there was a spring in there actually. So the bolts were holding the recovery vehicle onto the satellite with the spring compressed. And when the bolts were released, the spring would push the satellite or the recovery vehicle away from the satellite. It would then have its own short-term solid fuel rocket that would burn for a short period to slow it down enough so that it would deorbit. It would then spin with cold gas rockets around the edge, that four of them that would spin it, and that gave it stability. And so it would orient itself with the nose cone down. Then it would fall down through the atmosphere. And about 50,000 feet is when the first parachute would open. There were three separate parachutes, a tiny one that would help stabilize it, then a second one that was strong enough drag that it would pull the main parachute out. And then that would deploy and it would start falling slower and slower, slow enough for the airplane to snag it. And the target altitude for that was, I think, between 10 and 20,000 feet, but I think it was closer to 10. But it was falling slow enough that the airplanes had multiple chances to fly by and snag it. In fact, the Recoverer 14 mission, it took them 3 tries to actually capture the recovery vehicle. Here's another diagram of the same stuff, basically. And here's a picture of the airplane. And this is a practice run. So they had another airplane flying beside it, taking pictures. And this one's about to snag the top of the parachute there. And you can see a little loop here of the wires that were, or they're actually nylon rope that was strung between those two spars that were projecting out the back of the cargo bay.
Hey, Doug, this
Yeah.
is you. I have a question. What about heat and re-entry? I mean, how hot did this thing get prior, I assume prior to the parachutes?
Yeah, it got really hot. It got hot enough that the air around the capsule they would call plasma. It was up in the multiple thousands of degrees, and one of the challenges and one of the things they had to invent was a heat shield that covered the blunt end of the recovery vehicle that could withstand that kind of heat and not transmit it inside to the film, because they really had to protect that. And what they ended up doing was rejecting the copper heat shields that had been used previously, which were a couple of inches thick of copper. And they rejected them not because they didn't work, but because of some secondary characteristics, such as the copper would absorb the heat of the plasma and hang on to it. It would just heat up itself. So it would protect the contents that it was protecting, but it would stay hot. And so it would bake the film over time. And that was not good. So they ended up inventing an ablative process where they put layers and layers of plastic material, nylon, and other things. And those things would ablate. They would, as they heated up, they would fuse together, and they provided the best protection. They also, when it was heated, the outer layers would, the friction with the air would peel those away slowly. And they needed that so that, they had to engineer it so that it was thick enough so that when they lost layers, there were enough left to protect the contents.
So how did the parachute know it was supposed to come out?
It had an altimeter, a really simple altimeter. that measured barometric pressure, and it said, "Oh, I know where I am now." And when it hit 50,000 feet, it would just trigger some switches that would open a valve, and the small parachute would come out, and then that pulled out the second parachute, and then that pulled out the main parachute.
Good.
You know, pretty standard stuff for skydiving and things like that, but they had to tune the altimeter to a much higher altitude than anybody was typically going.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, yeah, kind of, Flintstone technology, really basic stuff. So these are pictures out the cargo hold of the airplane. So you can see the two booms that were extended out to the side, and then a loop at the end of the wire. The wire was strung between the booms, and then it fed itself back into the plane, and there was a winch in the plane that would pull the capsule and the parachute and everything in after it got snagged. There were also hooks on the wires that every few feet there was a hook that would help grab the wires and the parachute and so forth. But this is what it looked like if you were standing in the plane looking out the back. This is just another diagram of the satellite, the Agena, and the blacked out, the whited out area at the top, I'm sure said Corona/Discoverer. But you can see there was a fair amount of space taken up by propellant and the second stage rocket engine. And then there was telemetry, and then the left-hand chunk there was all the camera and the film and the recovery vehicle. There's a picture of them assembling the Agena at Lockheed. Here's a picture of a later satellite, because this one here you can see on the left there were two spools to take up the film. The one that's in the satellite itself that has a metal collar around it with some circuitry, that's mounted where it would go, and then the second one would go on the front of that, where the lower spool would get lifted up and put into there. On the right-hand end, you could see the port where the lens for the camera is sticking out to the side. And here's some engineers playing around with what looks to me to be a fully assembled satellite. Here's a picture of a later version of the system, where you can see the two spools of film. And on the right, you can see the light colored bands. Those are two cameras, because later they expanded the camera to include stereo photography. So they had two cameras. One was pointed slightly ahead of where the satellite was, and one was pointed slightly behind. And they would take pictures of the same thing, but as the satellite moved over the target, they would, well, first one of them took a picture of the target, and then as it moved a little farther, the second camera would get to take pictures of it. And then they'd compare them together with stereo viewers, and they would see, mostly from the shadows of what was below, the stereo view gave them a sense of how tall things were. But this was not the original design. This is the one that started around 63 and went through the mid 60s. Here's an engineering diagram of the the path that the film took when it was fed to the two different SRVs, the satellite recovery vehicles. So the SRV-A is the feed in the middle of the diagram going off to the left, and SRV-B is the feed that's down to the lower left. And there was a mechanism in the center there that with a pressure pad and a cutter that would cut the film, and that would be the end of the first SRV's film, and then it would automatically start feeding to the second one. So it's a, reasonably mid-level complex mechanism to do this. And, of course, it was all unattended, so it had to be pretty reliable. Here's another picture, another diagram of that same era with the two recovery vehicles drawn out, including the spool of film and then the little rocket behind it with a little nozzle that's pointing to the right. And that's just ahead of the two cameras, which are angled on the right-hand side. And then the spool of unexposed film is on the very right-hand side. So it was perpendicular to the camera. And so the film would have to come out and then turn 45 degrees and then feed over to the cameras. This was Corona M. It says, well, the Corona J was the overall mission refinement, but the camera was Corona M, which stands for mural, which gave them the stereo view. Oh, and this is a picture of an a competitive program called SAMOS, which was a purely signals intelligence system where they transmit the information down to Earth instead of returning the film. And the early versions of this took the film technology and added to the satellite the ability to develop the film, create a negative, and then scan the negative and use that scanned information to transmit back to the Earth. And this was their first attempt to get a satellite that would do that instead of having to wait for the film to come down and recover it and so forth. This system never really got off the ground. The project only lasted maybe a year and a half or so, I think. But it was developed right alongside the Corona stuff for a while. And that's the end of the slideshow.
Little context, the part of the reason for the lag there was that the typical studio television camera of that era weighed about 300 pounds.
Yeah.
And that there was no way you're going to put that into space. And I don't know if you remember what television back in the 50s was pretty low resolution, comparatively speaking. So it was a huge step forward to actually find something that was capable of taking images from space, digitizing it, and sending it back to Earth, given the technology limits at the time.
Yep. So I hope that gives you sort of a beginning to end view of what the missions were like, the trajectories and so forth.
I got to tell you, Doug, I'm blown away that thing worked. I mean, you think about the complexity of that and all the things it's impossible that worked.
Well, what really impresses me is that they had very, very limited feedback on what worked, what didn't work, how well it worked, because they had, very limited telemetry that they could measure. They could measure the sequence of things, and they could measure, they put in some of these components, the ability to record that, you told me to turn on. Yes, I turned on. But they couldn't transmit the results of that back, because they just didn't have the bandwidth. And so they would record it in the recovery vehicle, but that means you got to get it back. You got to do a whole mission just to run through the sequence and see how things were working. And that was incredibly expensive. Once they got the film back on that one mission, they included telemetry in the later missions, but they were live missions. I mean, one of the things that really was interesting about this whole effort was that the standard progress of engineering and development was you developed some ideas, you drew out a design, you built a prototype, you tested it. When you think it's tested well enough, then you put it in production, and it freezes. It stays in that state in production for a long period of time. You don't change it. You don't mess anything up, because you don't want to introduce errors and problems after it goes into production. Well, these guys weren't doing that. They were designing, drawing things, building prototypes, and the prototypes were the production vehicles. They'd try them, and as soon as they got one that worked, they just kept using it, and they kept doing the same thing that was successful. So they didn't have that normal progress, and they had to adapt to a whole different way of doing things. And in a sense, they were kind of cowboys. It's like, hey, did it work? Great, ship it.
Fire it.
All I can say is,
And believe me, I've been in the software development business, and we used to operate sometimes that way, and it is nerve-wracking.
all I can say is that when I was in middle school or junior high school and high school, I was one of those nerds who was one of the AV nerds who still doing that sort of, but I was one of those AV nerds that had to put the film in the projector and make it work. And your chances of getting that to work were about 50-50, 40.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to do that too.
Yeah. It would always jiggle and do kind of weird stuff. You have to push that little thing. I mean, to make something like this work in a rocket is mind blowing.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk about performance anxiety.
Yeah.
There's nothing like being the projectionist when the film breaks and you have to rethread the machine and get it going again. Yeah. Yeah. Bad stuff. Yeah.
So all of this was going on at the same time that the Mercury astronauts were getting together and getting ready to launch, correct?
This was actually before that. Pretty much all of this happened before that.
Okay.
Well, at least the development of this system.
Yeah,
because
I just looked it up, and it said that the group of astronauts were selected in '59.
Yep.
And Alan Shepard went suborbital in '61.
Yeah.
So they were like two different programs.
Yeah, I guess you could call them simultaneous. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But we didn't know about this one.
No, and the whole reason they started the MAN program was because of what they learned from this program. There was enough engineering knowledge accumulated that people started saying, hey, maybe we can do this on a larger scale, and we can do this in a way that would actually enable people to be up there.
Yeah. You mentioned that's they learned that they could do splashdown from this.
Yeah, that's why the MAN program used splashdowns in water, is because they got used to the Corona program doing that and seeing how well it worked. And they said, well, we'll just do it that way.
Did we all watch those in grade school?
Of
I
course.
did. The teacher would bring in a TV.
Yeah. But in the mid 50s, there was a lot of, before anyone had been in space, there was a lot of controversy over what it would be like. I mean, there were even people who were advocating that electricity would not work in space. They were saying, hey, that it just doesn't make sense. It can't work. And of course, that got debunked fairly quickly. But people were very concerned. Would electronics, would the things that we use on the ground work up there, because we didn't really know what the radiation levels would do to even simple mechanisms. We didn't know what the radiation levels would do to materials, to metal, to plastic, to insulation. And so there were lots of theories, but nobody really knew for sure until we actually put objects in space and recovered them and could examine them and see what happened to them. So this was all pioneering work, and a lot of materials people were watching and were involved in this to figure out, is it as hostile an environment as we thought it might be? Turns out it wasn't in many ways, but it was in some other ways. It's kind of hard to gauge, but they did collectively think, oh, okay, well, we know enough now that we can put people up there, and they started thinking seriously about that right as Corona was, successful. And the more missions that were successful, the more the confidence grew until Kennedy announced that we were going to put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s. And even that was, I don't know, that was a huge leap. I mean, if you look at the tech at the time, and I don't know if I would have made that commitment. So, yeah.
He wasn't an engineer, so he could do that. He was a dreamer.
Definitely not.
Yeah. I'm thinking it's another era. In high school, I remember the future engineers wandering around with slide rules. So this is around the time that you're talking. So.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's amazing.
When my father first went out to Sunnyvale to do the initial designs, not only was he using a drafting table and hand drawing the blueprints, the diagrams for the design, but throughout this whole project, the whole first few years, he was using a slide rule to do the engineering estimates and measurements for how much thrust was needed and what the orbital mechanics were of putting a satellite up and all of that stuff. I mean, he loved his slide rule. He used to give me lessons on the slide rule, and he said, yeah, and that's how you do multiplication, and this is how you do division, and then he'd flip it over, and there were different scales on the other side, and he said, and this is how you do, integrals, and it's like, what? Yeah, he was a master at the slide rule.
I still have my post-Versalog slide rule from.
I wish I had Bob's.
I have mine.
The good news is it never runs out of power.
And then Texas Instrument came up with the design, right?
The calculator.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
guys,
Remember how expensive those were at the
I
beginning?
have one of the first commercial calculators. It was called a Bomar Brain.
Oh, yeah.
And all it could do was arithmetic.
Yeah.
Four operations.
Yep.
And it was bigger. Well, I don't know. It was about the size of 3 packs of cigarettes. And it was, oh gosh, it was well over $100 to do arithmetic.
Yeah.
I still have my TI SR50,
Oh,
Wow.
and it still works, by the way. I
Sure.
don't use it anymore, but it works.
Solid state.
I wish I had my original personal computer. That would have been fun to keep, but
Yeah.
I don't know. Somewhere along the line, I had to discard it. Oh, the IBM PC that I got, I destroyed because I was trying to adapt it to do something, and I I took a saw to the case and because I had to expand it, and eventually it looked so sad I just threw it away. It's really too bad. But it was $3,000 for a paltry little
Yeah.
computer that could barely walk, let alone run. Yeah, crazy. Okay, let's call it a day. Next week we'll have more. I'm going to talk, I've got a few more stories that are kind of fun, and we'll talk about the later missions and how the whole thing wrapped up in the end.
Hawaii.
And at the rate we're going, I don't think we're going to have a fourth class, unless you guys want to reconvene and just talk. We may not have a fourth class, so we can decide next week whether we do or not. I also have a book that's dedicated to the air crews that flew the airplanes. That I'll send you a link to that. It's a PDF. And let's see what else.
Hey, Doug, the first video you showed,
Yeah.
we lost audio after the first few seconds.
Oh, okay.
And so is there a way that you can give us a link to see that?
Yeah, I can probably figure that out.
Because that looked
maybe
like it was gonna be pretty interesting, but without the audio, it lost a lot.
yeah. Oh, that's too bad. Okay, sorry about that.
Marty, be sure to make a note to bring up your Hawaii story next week.
Oh
Okay.
yeah, you want to tell that right now, real quick?
Okay, if you want me to.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I remember when Dad had to fly to Hawaii and Mom really wanted to go. And he said, "No, it's a work job. You won't have any fun. I'm going to be busy all day." And she really put the pressure on, but
You really want.
he just said, "No, you can't." And he was flying to Hawaii to scope out where the capsule could possibly land in the water. So he went out on a charter boat past the national national park that was in the water, that was the small islands going out, and he went out beyond that and scoped out that area. And that was the main reason he went. The funny story that he told was that when he got back and he was sitting in his hotel room, he really wanted to walk on the beach. And so he put on his bathing suit and went down to the beach and walked along the beach and looked at the water. But because it was a black operation, he had to carry it in his briefcase, so he had to carry his briefcase with him while he was
Yeah, I remember when he came back from that trip, he brought us all stuff, and he brought Mom a muumuu. And she loved that thing, big.
I still have it.
Dress. You still have it?
I still have it.
Oh my God.
That's great.
Wear it next week.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I can find it. But I know I have it.
He told me that he had to have the briefcase. It was chained to his wrist.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And he had to. It had to be chained to his wrist unless he was in his room and with it
Oh
alone.
my God.
And so I said, "But Dad, you were on the beach sunbathing with a briefcase chained to your wrist?" And he said, "Yeah, I really wanted to go."
And nobody noticed.
Yeah, I was going to say that's pretty obvious. I mean, talk about making yourself a target.
Right.
How many snapshots do you think he appears in?
The other thing is that I don't I don't know if this is true or not, but it seems like he wasn't really in Hawaii most of the time. He was on Johnson Island.
He was.
Yeah,
And that's about 300 miles from Hawaii.
yeah.
So he flew to Hawaii and then he flew there. Yeah, because that's where some of the air crews were based. And so he had to brief them and, get them up to speed on, what to expect and so forth.
He also told me that in order to get into some of the rooms, they had to do a scan of your face, make
Oh,
sure
I
it was
never heard
you.
that.
And he said something about they scanned your eyeball or something. I don't know. I don't really remember because I was a kid, but he said, we knocked on the door and then they'd open the door and then someone would come with a machine and they would scan your face. And if it was you, then you could go in.
And I remember him talking about the drafting table scenario where they went down underground and then they walked down this long hallway where no one was, and there were no doors until they got to the very end at the very last door, and that's where they went in the box with the drafting tables that were not assembled, and it was very lonely and they were all by themselves.
That's because Lockheed, there was a lot of jealousy between the companies, all the different companies, and Lockheed really resented having GE be a part of the project. They weren't subcontractors initially, but due to the corporate politics, eventually GE became a subcontractor under Lockheed for the recovery stuff. So there were times, so they weren't well received when they went out there. They were put in the basement in the worst conditions, and I don't think that changed substantially throughout the development of the systems. But there were a lot of, I mean, there were times when GE personnel would go out to the West Coast and the Lockheed gate would not let them on the property.
Oh, that's terrible.
And they have to go back into town, find a payphone, call back, have the request go up through the uppity ups and down, over and down, and eventually they'd be let in. It was just crazy stuff. I'll tell some stories about that next week.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Doug.
Time.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
Doug. Interesting.
Thank you.
Very well done. Thank you so much.